The frozen road. Officer Ethan Cole drummed his fingers against the cracked plastic of his patrol car's steering wheel, the rhythmic tap the only sound cutting through the silence. Outside, the winter night stretched wide and empty, a blanket of frost dulling the edges of the sleeping town. Every breath he took fogged up the windshield in little puffs, dissolving into nothing. Ethan glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:47 p.m. Just 13 minutes to go until the shift ended. 13 minutes until he could return to his one-bedroom apartment above the hardware store, heat up a can of chili, and fall asleep to the static hum of whatever late-night infomercial played loud enough to mask the silence. It had been a long winter. Hollow Ridge had never been much of a lively place, even at the height of summer, but winter stripped it bare. A town of empty streets, dark windows, and wind cutting through gaps in old wooden homes. Most of the residents were either too old to be out or too young to care, leaving Ethan to patrol shadows that never moved. He adjusted the heater, though it was a losing battle. The squad car was old, the kind of old that no amount of oil changes or repairs could salvage. The heat stuttered, and he could almost hear the engine's mechanical sigh. Not much longer now. One last loop, then home. The streetlights flickered overhead, their halos barely reaching the frozen pavement below. The frost sparkled, not festive like Christmas lights, but cold, uncaring like tiny knives set into the ground. Ethan turned onto Maple Street, eyes half-lidded, already mentally off-duty. Then they appeared. Two tiny figures burst out of the darkness ahead, bolting into the beam of his headlights. Ethan sat up so fast his knee knocked the gear shift, jarring the car into a brief lurch. His hand instinctively reached for his sidearm, reflexes honed by years on the force. But it wasn't a threat. It was children. A boy and a girl, both barefoot, both too small to be out alone. They ran toward the car, their feet slapping against the icy pavement with desperate, painful slaps. The boy, maybe 7 or 8, clutched the girl's hand, dragging her forward. She couldn't have been older than 4, her face half buried in her brother's thin pajama sleeve. The sight hit Ethan harder than a punch. He threw the car into park and yanked open the door. Cold air rushed in, stinging his face. "Please, please help us," the boy shouted, his voice ragged, raw from crying and cold air. "Our mama's dying." Ethan dropped to one knee, the rough gravel biting through his uniform pants. Where is she?" His voice came out sharper than intended, more officer than man, but the kids didn't flinch. The boy tugged his sleeve, urging him to follow. "Come. Hurry." Ethan didn't stop for backup, didn't call it in. He couldn't. There was something in the boy's voice, something that short-circuited every rule and regulation. It was desperation, but deeper, something older than his years, a bone-deep fear no child should carry. They ran. The children led him down a side road, past half-collapsed trailers and sheds that sagged under the weight of unshoveled snow. No Christmas lights here, no wreaths or warm porch glows, just dark windows and silence. Ethan's boots crunched against gravel and ice, and the sound seemed painfully loud compared to the children's light steps. The trailer they stopped at leaned heavily to one side, the front steps cracked and half-buried beneath a sheet of ice. The door hung slightly open, swaying in the breeze. It was the kind of place Ethan had been in before. The kind of place where quiet desperation hung in the air like smoke. The boy pointed with a trembling hand. "In there." Ethan drew his flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. He pushed the door open with his free hand, the creak cutting through the silent night like a scream. Inside, the air was colder than outside, thick with the stale smell of sickness and old food. The flashlight swept the room, revealing a sagging couch, a broken heater, and shelves nearly bare except for a few dented cans. In the middle of the floor lay a woman, her body curled in on itself, dark hair tangled across her pale face. Her breathing was ragged, shallow, each inhale a fight. Ethan stepped closer, kneeling beside her. His hand reached for her wrist, fingers pressing against her skin, and for a moment, his own breath caught in his throat. Beneath the shallow pulse, the feel of her skin, there was something disturbingly familiar. A scar along the wrist, a thin silver bracelet, half hidden by her sleeve. He swept her hair back with gentle fingers, and his world tilted. It was her. 15 years was a long time. People changed. Faces lost their edges, softened with time. But there were things you didn't forget. The angle of a jawline, the shape of a mouth that used to smile at you like you were her whole world. Charlotte. His heart kicked against his ribs so hard it hurt. She'd been everything once. The girl who filled his teenage summers, who made promises in the dark that they were too young to understand, whose tears he'd sworn to protect. And then he'd left. His mind went blank, but his hands kept moving. Training, muscle memory, the part of him that had learned how to save strangers even when his heart was breaking. He checked her breathing. Shallow, but there. Her skin was cold, clammy, her lips tinged blue. "Charlotte," he whispered, though she didn't respond. "Is she gonna die?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. His sister clung to his side, both of them barefoot, both of them trembling. Ethan wrapped his coat around them, hands shaking. "I don't know," he admitted, the hardest words for a cop to say. Then his flashlight caught something clutched in her other hand, fingers curled tightly around it even in unconsciousness. Metal glinted, scratched and worn but unmistakable. A badge. His badge. The one he'd given her when he left Hollow Ridge for the academy. A symbol, a promise, that she'd never be alone. Ethan's knees hit the floor, the old linoleum cold through his pants. His breath shuddered, a ragged thing that caught in his throat. "Please," the boy begged again, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Please don't let them take us." "Who?" Ethan's voice was hoarse. The boy shook his head, eyes darting to the window like something might burst through it at any moment. "The people. The ones who take kids. They'll split us up." Ethan knew exactly who he meant. Social services, overworked and understaffed. Trying their best, but too stretched thin to understand that siblings weren't meant to be torn apart. He glanced down at Charlotte, her fingers still curled around that old badge, a symbol of protection that hadn't meant a damn thing when she needed it. "Not this time," he thought. "Okay," Ethan said softly. "Okay." The boy blinked up at him, eyes wide with hope and distrust in equal measure. "I'm not letting anyone take you," Ethan promised. And for the first time in 15 years, a promise from his lips felt like the truth. The buried past. The cold metal of the stretcher squeaked as paramedics hoisted Charlotte into the back of the ambulance. Her pale face, framed by matted hair, was barely visible beneath the oxygen mask. Condensation fogged the plastic with every shallow breath she took, each one a reminder that her body was still fighting, however weakly. Ethan stood just outside the back doors, the boy and girl clinging to either side of his legs like their bodies alone could anchor him to reality. Snow flurried around them, soft flakes settling in the children's uncombed hair. They didn't flinch at the cold anymore. It had become part of them, a constant companion like hunger or fear. "Ride with us?" the paramedic asked, already knowing the answer. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Yeah." But the real question wasn't whether he'd ride to the hospital. It was what came after. The hospital lights were too bright, buzzing with that relentless fluorescent hum. Ethan sat stiff-backed in the waiting room, the children curled into either side of him, sharing his police-issued jacket like a blanket. The chairs were plastic, built more for endurance than comfort. Jacob, the boy, whose name Ethan had gently pried from him on the way over, was wide-eyed, his fingers locked in Maya's hair, like keeping her close would keep everything else from slipping away. "You're not from around here," Jacob said softly, his voice almost lost under the hum. Ethan's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile if it had more strength behind it. "Used to be." Jacob stared up at him, a child's ability to see through walls and past secrets sharpening his gaze. Did you know my mama back then? Ethan's throat tightened. Yeah. Did you love her? The question came out too direct, too innocent, like kids always had a knack for cutting to the center of the truth adults spent years dancing around. Ethan's hands curled into fists on his knees. I did, he said, barely louder than a whisper. Still do. Jacob processed that in silence, turning the idea over in his head like a coin. After a while, he just rested his cheek against Ethan's arm. It was the kind of acceptance only a child could offer. Unconditional, unquestioning, at least for now. A nurse approached, clipboard in hand, her expression both professional and hesitant. Officer Cole. Ethan stood, gently disentangling himself from the children. How is she? The nurse glanced at Jacob and Maya, then back at him, uncertainty flickering across her face. We've stabilized her for now. Severe pneumonia, combined with prolonged malnutrition and exposure to cold. Her immune system's completely shot. The shame in Ethan's chest burned hot enough to thaw through the ice he kept wrapped around his heart. He'd been out there, driving past streets lined with trailers and broken-down cars, and he hadn't seen her, hadn't even thought to look. Can I see her? He asked, his voice quieter now. The nurse hesitated, only for a minute. He followed her down the hallway, his boots echoing with each step. The sterile air smelled like disinfectant, and something underneath, that faint chemical tang of fear and hopelessness. The door to her room was slightly ajar, the monitor beeping its steady, fragile rhythm. She looked so small. Charlotte Boyd had once been a wildfire, all bright eyes and laughter loud enough to fill every room. Her smile could unravel him, back when they were young, and believed the world would bend for them. Now her face was drawn tight, skin pale as milk against the tangle of hair and tubes. The fragile rise and fall of her chest made something break inside him, something he hadn't even realized was still intact. He stepped closer, the weight of all those years crushing his ribs. But she didn't wake. Her hand lay limp at her side, fingers curled slightly inward. The badge, his badge, was gone, left somewhere along the way between the trailer floor and the hospital bed. But she was still holding on to something. A folded piece of paper, crumpled from being gripped too tight, too long. Ethan carefully slid it from her hand. The handwriting was hers, loopy but slanted with exhaustion. The ink had blood at the edges, like she'd started crying before she finished writing. If something happens to me, don't let them take my kids. The note was unsigned. There didn't need to be a signature. A hand touched his elbow, and Ethan turned to find Jacob standing there, barefoot on the cold tile floor. The kid's chin jutted out stubbornly, but his eyes were red, swollen from crying. She's not gonna die, Jacob said, his voice fierce, as if saying it would make it true. Ethan crouched down so they were eye level. No, he agreed. She's not. But he wasn't just making a promise to the boy. He was making one to himself. The morning dragged in sluggish and pale, light filtering weakly through the hospital windows. The social worker arrived early, a woman in her 50s with sensible shoes and weary eyes. Her clipboard was covered in post-it notes, each one a tiny brick in the wall that was bureaucracy. Ethan knew the type, overworked, underpaid, and numb to the stories that were supposed to break your heart. Are you a relative? She asked, flipping through her forms without looking up. Ethan's jaw tightened. No. Her pen hovered. A family friend. The silence stretched between them. Something like that. The social worker's lips pursed, not judgmental, just resigned. If she doesn't regain consciousness within 48 hours, we'll need to place the children in temporary care. Jacob stood nearby, listening even if they thought he couldn't hear. His fists curled at his sides. No, he said, voice cracking with the force of it. We stay with her. The social worker softened slightly, bending down to his level. Sweetheart, we just want to make sure you and your sister are safe. We're safe with him. Jacob's finger jabbed toward Ethan. He's a cop. Cops protect people. The weight of those words settled over Ethan like a lid blanket. Protecting people was easy when they were strangers. These weren't strangers. These were his. "I'll take them," Ethan said, the words out before he could second-guess them. The social worker's brows lifted slightly. "Do you have legal authority?" "No," Ethan admitted, "but I can get it." She sighed, scribbled a note, and walked away. That was the thing about a system built to be fair. It moved slow, grinding forward one paper at a time, too slow for kids who couldn't wait. Back in the waiting room, Maya was curled up in one of the chairs, Ethan's oversized jacket drowning her tiny frame. Jacob sat beside her, one arm protectively across her shoulders, the other clutching the stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Ethan sank into the chair beside them. "I'm gonna make some calls, okay?" Jacob's eyes were dark with mistrust. "You gonna call the people who take us away?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "I'm calling the people who'll help me keep you." Jacob's gaze searched his face for cracks, the way a kid who's been lied to too many times learns to do. Whatever he saw there, it was enough. "Okay," Jacob said softly, "but don't mess it up." Ethan almost smiled. "Deal." As the sun climbed higher, Ethan pulled out his phone. The number was still saved, though he hadn't called it in years. It rang twice before the gravelly voice of his old captain answered. "Ethan Cole, thought you were done saving the world." Ethan stared at the children, at the girl who trusted him without question, and the boy who trusted him only because there was no other choice. "Not done yet," Ethan said. "I need a favor. A promise is not enough." The emergency room waiting chairs creaked beneath Ethan's weight, plastic groaning under his restless shifting. His patrol jacket lay folded over the backrest beside him, leaving him in a plain gray sweatshirt, the kind that made him feel more like a man than a cop. It was better that way. Tonight, he didn't need a badge. Tonight, Ethan Cole needed to be someone two scared kids could trust. Jacob sat across from him, knees pulled to his chest, chin resting on them like a boy who'd long since outgrown the comfort of stuffed animals. Beside him, Maya slept, her thumb stuck between her lips, Ethan's jacket wrapped around her like a cocoon. Even in sleep, her brow furrowed, like her little mind knew something was wrong, but couldn't piece together what. The weight of what he'd promised, "I'll take them," sat heavy on Ethan's chest. He hadn't meant to say it, not because it wasn't true, but because the second the words left his mouth, they were carved into stone. That's how Ethan operated. Promises weren't pretty phrases. They were bricks in the wall of who you were. Either you stood behind them, or you crumbled. But promises didn't mean shit to social workers and state agencies. They wanted paperwork, clearances, background checks, all the things that made sense on paper, but fell apart when you saw the terror in a kid's eyes. Jacob didn't need a checklist. He needed someone who would fight. Ethan scrolled through his contacts, thumb hovering over one name, Captain Donnelly, his old superior. The man who once told him, "Some fights aren't worth the bruises, Cole. Walk away before you bleed for something you can't win." He tapped the number. "Cole." Donnelly's voice was thick with sleep. "You still breathing?" "Barely." Ethan rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I need a favor." "That usually means paperwork or bodies." "Which one?" "Custody," Ethan said, tasting the absurdity of the word in his mouth. "There's 2 kids, Charlotte Boyd's kids." A long pause. Donnelly had been around back when Charlotte was part of Ethan's life. He knew enough not to ask for details. "You the father?" "No." The truth dug into his ribs like a knife. "But they're all she's got." Donnelly exhaled sharply. "Cole, you know how this works. Family gets first crack. Foster system if there's no next of kin. They're gonna split them up, Donnelly," Ethan said, voice low. "And their mom's in a hospital bed, half dead. Are you officially licensed for foster care?" "No." "Have a case file open with CPS?" "No." "Any legal standing at all?" "No." Donnelly snorted softly. "So you've got nothing." I've got 2 kids who ran barefoot through the snow begging me to save their mom. That landed like a punch. The silence stretched longer this time, until Donnelly's voice returned, softer. I'll make a call. But you're fighting the whole system here, Cole. You ready for that? Ethan glanced at Jacob. The boy's gaze locked on him, measuring, weighing, waiting for a lie that never came. I've fought worse. The house they ran from. Ethan's squad car rolled to a stop in front of Charlotte's trailer, dawn just beginning to push through the bruised sky. The windows were dark, except for the faint yellow glow leaking from the broken heater inside, a heater that barely gave enough warmth to fight off frost. Jacob climbed out first, his breath fogging up the air. He didn't hesitate, leading Ethan up the uneven steps like it was his job to show the cop what survival looked like. Maya stayed tucked into Ethan's arms, still half asleep, her cheek pressed against his chest. The trailer felt even smaller inside, stripped bare by poverty and the quiet sort of neglect that happens when you're too tired to keep fighting. There were no family photos, no art projects on the fridge, no signs that a home had ever existed here, just survival. On the fridge, a faded eviction notice was pinned under a chipped magnet shaped like a sunflower. Ethan's jaw tightened. Why didn't she ask for help? He muttered. Jacob stood near the couch, arms crossed. She said cops only show up when something bad happens. Ethan froze. The words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they were. That's not always right, he said softly. Was for her. Maya stirred in his arms, whimpering softly before her eyes fluttered open. Where's Mama? She whispered. In the hospital, Ethan said gently, brushing her hair back from her face. She's getting better. It wasn't quite a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Kids deserved something to believe in. Jacob walked into the small bedroom he shared with Maya. 2 mismatched blankets on a twin mattress, a plastic crate serving as a nightstand. There was no closet, just a cardboard box labeled Maya's Stuff, and another labeled My Stuff. In the corner, a broken toy fire truck sat on its side, wheels missing. We can't stay here, Ethan said. Jacob's jaw set, the stubborn line of it far too old for his face. It's our home. It's a trap, Ethan countered. The second CPS sees this, they'll say it's unfit. You know what happens after that? Jacob's gaze flicked to Maya, and his shoulders hunched. They take us. Ethan knelt down in front of him. Not if I can help it. Can you? The doubt in his voice was sharp. Ethan didn't blame him. Promises were just noise until someone proved they were worth trusting. The caseworker. By afternoon, Ethan sat across a chipped table in the CPS office, fluorescent lights flickering overhead. Elaine McAdams, the caseworker, was thin, her brown hair pulled into a tight bun that didn't match the tired lines on her face. Her desk was covered in files, coffee cups, and stress. So, Officer Cole. She leafed through a thin folder. You want emergency custody of 2 minors. You have no legal relationship to them. You're not married to their mother. You have no prior guardianship agreement. Ethan folded his hands on the table. Correct. Do you understand how impossible this is? No, Ethan said evenly. I understand how hard it is. Impossible's your word. She tapped her pen on the file, eyes narrowing slightly. Are you stable? Job. House. No criminal record. Clean bill of health. Ever been under investigation? No. Ever been sued for misconduct? Ethan's jaw twitched. No. Ever had children of your own? His stomach turned. No. She leaned back in her chair. What makes you think you're the best option? Ethan's hands curled into fists under the table. Because they ran through the snow to find me, he said. Because they trust me. And because the system you work for doesn't give a damn about keeping siblings together. Her lips pressed into a thin line. That's not fair. Neither is splitting up kids who've already lost everything. Her gaze softened, just slightly. If the mother wakes up and designates you guardian, that helps. "She's not awake," Ethan said. "And you know how long it takes to get a court order." "That's not up to me." "Then whose job is it?" His voice edged toward sharp. She sighed. "The judge will want a hearing. Until then, they'll be placed in state care." "No," Ethan said firmly. "You're not taking them." "I don't have a choice." Ethan stood, looming over the desk. "Neither do I." Emergency options. Outside, Ethan leaned against his car, rubbing a hand over his face. The cold didn't bite as sharply as before. Anger had a way of insulating you. His phone rang. Donnelly again. "Got you an emergency petition," Donnelly said. "Judge Richter. Old bastard, but he hates CCGS politics. If you show up with the kids and make a case, you might buy time." "When?" "Tomorrow morning." Ethan exhaled, looking toward the hospital where Charlotte lay, her children waiting in the back seat. "I'll be there." "Cole." "Yeah. This is one hell of a fight to pick." Ethan looked at Jacob's reflection in the window, the boy watching him, waiting for him to fail. Some fights are worth bleeding for. A stranger's shadow. The courthouse doors felt heavier than Ethan remembered. Maybe it was the weight of the two small hands gripping either side of his jacket. Jacob clung to his left, chin up, jaw clenched tight in that brave but terrified way kids try to hide. Maya's grip was smaller, but no less fierce. Her mittened fingers tangled in his sleeve like she was afraid the wind might steal her away if she let go. Ethan had faced down armed suspects, stood between civilians and burning wreckage, and braced for gunfire behind flimsy car doors. None of it compared to walking two scared kids into a courtroom where their fate would be decided by people who'd never even seen their faces before today. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and paper. The receptionist barely glanced up as Ethan signed them in, her nails clicking against the keyboard like a countdown to disaster. Jacob didn't sit. He stood beside Ethan's knee, hands shoved into his too short jacket pockets, eyes flickering toward every person who walked past the glass doors. He was looking for someone. "You expecting somebody?" Ethan asked, voice low. Jacob's shoulders jerked up and down. "I dunno. Maybe." It was a lie. Ethan knew the kind that wasn't meant to fool anyone, just to keep a fragile barrier between fear and reality. Jacob was expecting a man. Ethan could see it in the way his jaw kept locking every time footsteps echoed too loud in the hallway. "Who is it?" Ethan asked. Jacob's voice was barely a whisper. "The man Mama was hiding from." The words hit like a hammer, cracking something in Ethan's chest. Charlotte hadn't said much the last time he saw her years ago, but Ethan knew there had been someone. A man who turned her bright eyes into something dull, someone who taught her how to flinch at the sound of footsteps on the porch. Ethan had been too wrapped up in his own life back then to ask the right questions. "Who is he?" Ethan asked again, softer. Jacob shook his head hard. "Mama said not to say his name." "Why?" "Because if you say his name, it's like calling him." Jacob's voice wavered, his bravado cracking around the edges. "And he always comes." Ethan exhaled slowly, hand settling protectively on the back of Jacob's neck. "He's not coming today." He hoped. The courtroom battlefield. The family court was smaller than Ethan expected, less like a law and order courtroom, and more like a school library with a raised desk. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a pair of reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose, peered down at the small cluster of people in front of him. Ethan stood, flanked by Jacob and Maya, with Donnelly beside him, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was at least a decade out of style. Across the aisle sat Elaine Cadams, the CPS worker, her folder thick with documents, none of which had faces, none of which knew how Maya hummed herself to sleep, or how Jacob held his sister's hand even in his sleep. "We're here to determine the emergency placement of Jacob and Maya Boyd," the judge said, shuffling papers. "Are there any relatives present?" Silence. "Any next of kin willing to step forward?" Ethan's stomach unclenched just slightly. Charlotte's family had long since disappeared into the woodwork, leaving her alone when she needed them most. There was no one. Then the door opened. The air seemed to shift, not physically, but in that subtle way animals sense a predator nearby. Ethan turned, every muscle in his body locking as a man walked into the room. He was tall, with the thick build of someone who used strength to get what he wanted. His hair was short, military short, but uneven, like he cut it himself in a gas station mirror. His hands were too still at his sides. No nervous fidgeting, no hesitation, just two fists curled at rest, like weapons waiting to be used. Jacob's entire body stiffened, one hand clutching Ethan's sleeve, the other reaching instinctively for Maya. Ethan didn't need an introduction. The man stopped beside the CPS lawyer, his smile too wide, teeth too white. "Martin Wells," he said, his voice a little too loud for the room. "I'm Jacob's biological father." Maya whimpered. Jacob didn't move. Ethan's breath slowed to a dangerous crawl. Old ghosts, new threats. There was no outburst. Not yet. Martin sat down like a man used to being watched, every movement deliberate, controlled. His smile never faded, but it didn't touch his eyes. It was a mask, stretched too thin. "Your Honor," Martin said, leaning slightly forward. "I've been looking for my son for years. I just want the chance to be his father." Jacob's grip on Ethan's sleeve grew bone-tight. Ethan stepped forward. "Your Honor, this man has served his time." Martin's lawyer interrupted smoothly. "My client's past is irrelevant. What matters is his right as a biological parent." Ethan's jaw locked so tight his teeth ached. The judge held up a hand. "We'll hear both sides." Donnelly spoke first, his voice gravelly but steady. "Officer Cole has been the children's sole protector during this crisis. He's provided food, shelter, and ensured their safety while their mother fights for her life." The CPS lawyer stood. "That's admirable, but Officer Cole has no legal standing." "Officer Cole," the judge said, peering down at him, "what is your relationship to the children?" Ethan could have lied. He could have spun some tale about a distant uncle or long-lost cousin, but lies wouldn't hold. Not with Jacob standing there, trusting him to tell the truth. "I used to love their mother," Ethan said simply. Martin's snort filled the room. Ethan ignored it. "I left town a long time ago. But when these kids ran out into the snow, barefoot, begging me to save their mom, I made them a promise." "Promises aren't legal standing," the judge said, though his tone wasn't cruel. "No," Ethan admitted. "But they're everything to these kids." The judge turned to Jacob. "Son, would you like to say something?" Jacob's throat bobbed, but he stepped forward. His small hands were fists, shaking slightly, but he stood his ground. "I don't know him." Jacob's voice was soft but clear. "He never came before. He never looked for me or Maya. He doesn't love us." Martin's smile faltered, just for a second. "Officer Ethan's the one who comes," Jacob said. "He found us. He took care of us, and he's not scared of the dark." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with words left unsaid. Martin's lawyer started to object, but the judge raised a hand. "I'll need time to review this," the judge said. "For now, the children will remain in Officer Cole's care." The gavel fell. The hallway showdown. Outside the courtroom, Martin caught up to them. Ethan stepped between him and the kids before Martin could get close. "This isn't over," Martin said, his smile gone. "It's over if you come near them again," Ethan said, voice low, steady. Martin leaned in, close enough that Ethan could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You think you're her hero. I know who you are. You're the guy who ran." Ethan didn't flinch. "Yeah, but I came back." Martin's eyes narrowed. "Enjoy playing daddy, cop. I'll see you again." He walked away, leaving Ethan with the cold certainty that this fight was far from over. Jacob stood at his side, Maya's hand clutched in his. "You'll stop him," Jacob said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. a fragile belief built on a promise Ethan couldn't afford to break. "Yeah," Ethan said softly, resting a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "I will." And for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. The line we draw. The squad car's engine ticked softly as Ethan sat in his driveway, hands locked around the steering wheel long after the kids had gone inside. His house wasn't much. A single-story rental with crooked shutters and a front step that creaked like it was warning him of every footfall. But tonight, it was a fortress. Jacob had gone straight to the couch, curling into a ball with his arms around Maya, their small bodies wrapped in the blanket Ethan had draped over them the night before. No cartoons, no games, just silence. They didn't ask if Martin was coming. They didn't have to. Their silence asked for them. Ethan sat in the driveway with the engine off, headlights still cutting across the street, illuminating the house across from his. A dark, empty shell that no one had lived in for years. That house had been up for rent 3 times, but no one ever stayed. The kind of place you could disappear into. A place for someone like Martin Wells. Ethan could feel him out there, somewhere just past the edge of the headlights, where the dark swallowed everything whole. It wasn't fear. Ethan had faced men like Martin before. But this was different. The last time he'd fought for something, it had been abstract. A job, a case, justice in a file folder. This was family. His phone buzzed on the dashboard. "Donnelly, you still breathing?" Donnelly's gravel-rough voice filled the car when Ethan answered. "Verily," Ethan muttered. "You get the emergency custody order." Ethan's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "Temporary. The judge gave me 2 weeks. They're calling it a cooling-off period. If Charlotte doesn't wake up, they revisit everything." 2 weeks is a lifetime if you do it right," Donnelly said. "I pulled what strings I could. But listen, Martin's lawyer already filed an appeal." "Of course he did." Ethan's stomach churned. "What's their angle?" "That you're no one," Donnelly said bluntly. "No legal tie, no biological connection, no marriage certificate. Martin's blood. That's all they care about." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of it pressing into his chest. "Blood doesn't make you family. Try explaining that to a judge who's seen more broken foster homes than Christmas dinners," Donnelly said. "You'll need more than promises, Ethan." Ethan glanced at the house, the faint light in the living room window. Jacob's shadow crossed it, small but sturdy, already checking the locks. "I got more than promises," Ethan said quietly. "I got them." Fortress at the end of the street. The first thing Ethan did after hanging up was check the locks. All of them. Front door, back door, windows, basement hatch. Every point of entry. He added the extra slide bolt on the front door, the one that felt excessive when he moved in, but now seemed like the only thing standing between safety and chaos. Jacob stood silently beside him the whole time, watching how his hands moved, memorizing the pattern. The kid was building his own map, a survival guide in real time. Ethan hated that he even knew how. "Your mom teach you to check locks like this?" Ethan asked quietly. Jacob's mouth was a tight line. "Sometimes. She teach you how to hide." Jacob nodded once. Ethan's gut twisted, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he led Jacob to the front window, showing him the motion sensor light that lit up the porch like a stadium. "You see this light go on. You wake me up, no matter what." Jacob nodded again. Maya was in the kitchen, carefully stacking plastic cups into towers, a habit Ethan recognized as the kind of game kids played when they couldn't make sense of the world around them. She didn't look up when Ethan knelt beside her. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently. She kept stacking. "Did your mama ever tell you what to do if a bad man came to the door?" Maya's hand stilled, her little fingers trembling on the top cup. She didn't answer. Instead, she climbed into Ethan's lap and buried her face against his chest. That was answer enough. Charlotte's ghost. The hospital was a 30-minute drive, but Ethan made it in 20. Visiting hours were over, but they knew him by now. The nurse at the desk gave him a look, part pity, part curiosity, but she waved him through. Charlotte's room was dark except for the soft glow of the monitors, their steady beeping filling the silence like a mechanical heartbeat. Her skin looked even paler against the white sheets, her hair limp and tangled across the pillow. Ethan sat beside her, one hand on the rail of the bed, the other fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. There was too much to say, so he didn't say anything at first. Just sat there, listening to her breathe, watching the fragile rise and fall of her chest. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "I found them." Her face didn't change, but Ethan kept talking. "They were so scared, Charlotte, running through the snow barefoot. Jacob, he's trying so hard to be brave. And Maya, she's got your eyes, you know that." His throat tightened, but the words kept coming. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I didn't know things got this bad. I should have." He stopped, jaw clenching. "Doesn't matter. I'm here now." The monitors beeped in slow, steady rhythm, her silence both deafening and comforting. "I need you to wake up," Ethan whispered. "They need you. I can fight this, but not without you." He leaned back, exhaustion pressing him into the chair. Outside the window, the world felt too big, too cold. But here, beside her, he could pretend for a minute that there was still time to fix what broke between them. The warning. Ethan didn't see the envelope until he got home. It was tucked into the screen door, no postage, no address. Just his name scrawled in thick, uneven handwriting. He knew before he even opened it. The paper inside was creased, dirty at the edges, like it had been handled too much. Only 3 words were written. "You can't win." There was no signature. None was needed. Ethan stood on the porch, the note crumpled in his fist, the cold slicing through his sweatshirt like knives. His breath fogged the air, but his mind was clear. He'd dealt with men like Martin before, men who believed threats were power, who thought control came from fear. Ethan wasn't afraid, but Jacob and Maya were. That was enough to make this personal. Storm at the door. It came 2 nights later, long after the kids were asleep. The house was silent except for the creak of the old furnace and the soft hum of cartoons Ethan had left playing to comfort Maya. The motion light on the porch flicked on, spilling bright white into the living room. Ethan was on his feet before he was fully awake. His service weapon was in his hand out of instinct, held low but ready. He moved to the window, keeping his body to the side, peering through the curtain. A figure stood at the edge of the porch, just past the reach of the light. Broad-shouldered, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Martin. Ethan unlocked the door, opening it just wide enough to step outside. Cold bit into his skin, but the heat in his chest burned hotter. "You're trespassing," Ethan said. Martin smiled, wide and toothy. "Just wanted to see my boy. You lost that right a long time ago." Martin's smile curdled. "You think this ends in a courtroom. You think paper keeps them safe." Ethan took 1 step forward, close enough to see the twitch in Martin's jaw. "You set foot on this property again, and I'll bury you so deep they'll need sonar to find you." Martin leaned in. "You're just a guy playing hero." Ethan didn't blink. "And you're just a scared little man who can't break anyone unless they're smaller than you." For a moment, they stood there, 2 men, 2 pasts, 1 future. Martin stepped back. "See you soon, hero." Ethan didn't move until Martin's shadow disappeared into the night. Then, and only then, did he lock the door behind him and return to the couch where Jacob slept. He laid a hand on the boy's shoulder, a silent promise. Whatever it took, he'd keep them safe. Where promises live. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat in the worn armchair facing the front door, service weapon resting on the small table beside him, a cold cup of coffee long forgotten next to it. The house was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, each second counting down to whatever was coming next. Outside, Snow drifted silently beneath the streetlights, soft and deceptive, masking the kind of darkness no weather could ever cover. Maya slept curled up in the corner of the couch, her small hand clutching a patchy stuffed rabbit missing its right ear. Jacob was half asleep on the other end of the couch, though Ethan could see the boy's eyelids twitch every time the floor creaked or the wind tapped against the window. The kids weren't waiting for Santa. They were waiting for him, the man in the shadows, the man who had shaped their lives without ever needing to be present. Martin Wells. Even when he wasn't there, he was a ghost in every room, in every locked door, in every whispered rule about staying quiet and out of sight. Ethan's jaw clenched so tight it ached. Not in this house. Not ever again. The hospital awakening. The phone call came at dawn, the tinny ring vibrating against the wooden table. Ethan snatched it up, his throat dry from a night of silence. "She's awake," said a nurse's voice, words clipped but bright. Ethan closed his eyes, the flood of relief so strong it made him dizzy. "She's talking." "Not much," the nurse admitted, "but she's stable enough to answer questions, if you want to see her before." "On my way," Ethan said, already moving. Jacob stirred as Ethan knelt beside him. "Stay with Maya," Ethan whispered. "I'm going to check on your mom." The boy's eyes, wide and sleep-drunk, locked on Ethan's face. "What if he comes?" "He won't." Ethan's hand settled on the boy's shoulder. "The locks are good. You know the drill." Jacob gave a slow, solemn nod, too serious for a kid his age. "Okay." The hospital room smelled like bleach and plastic tubing. Charlotte lay propped against the pillows, skin pale but her eyes open, dull with exhaustion but open. Her hair was clean now, pulled back into a loose braid, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her thin hospital blanket. The moment she saw him, the flicker of old memories crossed her face. Then the walls slammed down. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stared. Ethan took the seat beside her bed, his hands resting on his knees, knuckles pale. "You found them," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. "They found me," Ethan corrected. Her fingers clenched the blanket tighter. "Are they okay?" "They're scared," he admitted, "but they're safe." Charlotte's head tilted back against the pillow, eyes closing for a moment. "I tried to keep them safe. I ran every time he got close. I thought if I kept moving." "You did everything you could," Ethan said, voice low but certain. Her eyes snapped open, sharper now. "If I'd done everything, I wouldn't be here. And they wouldn't have ended up barefoot in the snow." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They're with me now. For as long as you need." "Why?" Her voice cracked on the word. He could have given 1,000 answers. "Because they deserve better. Because they're yours. Because I wasn't there before. And I'm not making that mistake again." But all he said was, "Because I promised them." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "He's coming, you know." Ethan didn't pretend not to know who she meant. Let him. A long night's promise. The sun was setting when Ethan returned home. The house felt different now. Less like a sanctuary, more like a battleground. The locks were still in place, the windows reinforced with wooden dowels Ethan had cut that afternoon. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a message. Jacob met him at the door. "Did you see her?" Ethan knelt, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "She's awake. She asked about you." The boy's face flickered with relief and fear, warring inside him. "Is she coming home?" "Soon," Ethan promised. "But until then, I'm here." Jacob's throat bobbed, words trying to escape and failing. "Hey," Ethan said softly. "You're not alone, kid." The boy lunged forward, arms wrapping around Ethan's neck in a desperate, fierce hug. Ethan's breath caught, but his arms came up, holding Jacob tight, the small body trembling against him. Too much weight on those shoulders. Too many nights spent wondering if the world was safe. "You're gonna stay," Jacob whispered, voice muffled against Ethan's shirt. "Yeah, kid," Ethan whispered back. "I'm staying." The final visit. It happened just after midnight. The motion light flared, shadows dancing across the porch. Ethan's eyes snapped open instantly, feet already hitting the floor before his brain caught up. His weapon was in his hand as he moved to the window, careful to stay just out of sight. Martin stood at the edge of the yard, hands shoved in his coat pockets, breath fogging the air in slow, deliberate puffs. He wasn't trying to sneak in. He wanted to be seen. Ethan opened the door, stepping out onto the porch, his boots crunching against the frost. "You're not too smart," Ethan said evenly. "You're on camera." Martin smirked. "You think a camera's gonna save you?" "No," Ethan said, "but it'll make sure everyone sees what happens if you take one step closer." Martin took a step forward anyway. Ethan's gun came up, not shaking, not uncertain. "Go ahead," Ethan said quietly. "Give me a reason." Martin's smile faltered, just for a second. "You think you're their daddy now?" "No," Ethan said, voice steady. "I'm the man standing between you and them. That's all I need to be." Martin's fists curled at his sides. "You can't keep this up forever. I only need to keep it up until the law catches up to you." Ethan's eyes didn't blink. "But if you want to find out how fast I can end this right here, step 1 inch closer." Martin's jaw clenched, his hands twitched at his sides. But something in Ethan's voice, calm, certain, deadly, kept him rooted in place. "You think you're better than me," Martin said. "I don't think about you at all," Ethan said. "Get off my property." Martin lingered a beat too long, like he wanted to say something else, or maybe he just wanted to be the last man standing. But in the end, he turned and walked back into the dark, his silhouette swallowed by the night. Ethan stood on the porch long after Martin was gone, heart pounding beneath the calm. This was his line, and no one crossed it. Family. Found. A week later, Charlotte was home. She was thinner than before, her skin still pale, but she stood on Ethan's porch with her hand on Maya's shoulder, Jacob at her side. Her eyes met Ethan's, wary and soft all at once. "You saved them," she said, voice quiet. "They saved me first," Ethan said. Charlotte stepped inside, her children clinging to her sides, but even after they let go, they still hovered near Ethan. Jacob's small shoulder bumping against Ethan's hip, Maya's fingers curling into the hem of his shirt. "They love you," Charlotte said softly, when the kids weren't listening. Ethan's throat tightened. "I love them too." She nodded, eyes shining with tears. "So what do we do now?" Ethan glanced down at Jacob and Maya, who were already rearranging the living room pillows into some sort of fort. "We figure it out," he said. "Together." And for the first time in years, together didn't sound like a promise too big to keep. It sounded like home.